Hello and welcome to Incorruptible Massachusetts. This is our goal is really to help you understand state politics. So we talk about why it's so broken, what we could have here if we fixed it, and how you can get involved. So today we are talking about rent control. We have some amazing guests. As usual, we're going to let our regulars go first, save our special guests for last. Jordan Berg Powers, you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Jordan Berg Powers. I use he, him. I have some experience working in progressive politics, and I'm very excited to be talking about rent control today.
Jonathan Cohn.
Jonathan Cohn, he, him, activist based in Boston on progressive electoral and issue-based work here in Massachusetts. And we have two amazing guests with us today.
Anna Callahan, she, her, coming at you from Medford. And Representative Mike Connolly.
Good afternoon, State Rep Mike Connolly, he, him pronouns. As you can see, I'm a renter here in Cambridge, was raised in public housing that was built by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I'd like to see more of that, and have been working on the Tenant Protection Act and trying to lift the ban on rent control for a few years now on Beacon Hill.
Ooh, and Beth Huang.
Hi, everyone. I'm Beth. I go by she, her. I'm the director of the Massachusetts Voter Table. I'm also a renter in Cambridge, which means I have exactly the same cabinets as Mike does in his apartment. I'm also an active member in the Boston Democratic Socialists of America.
Fantastic. So I am also a renter. Seems like we got majority renters here. And the question, we want to first just talk a little bit about what is rent control. I think the three of us goofballs are going to chime in first. Really it's not about sort of setting any sort of prices or that they can increase or anything like that. It's the idea that any city could have any kind of limit on how much rents could be raised. So, if your rent could be doubled next year without some kind of rent control.
Yeah, and I just want to tag into that. I feel like that often when there are discussions about rent control and kind of rent stabilization, whatever term people want to use for it, people are often opponents often immediately start debating the idea of freezing rents. And not throwing any shade at that idea, but that's not the point of discussion. Oftentimes when we're talking about policy, it's that in the current market setting, that if a landlord can raise rent, can double rent, can triple rent in a single year after they've done nothing to improve a property, or even perhaps if they've actively avoided maintenance concerns from a tenant, and they can raise that, there is nothing enforceable against that there's nothing to say that they can't do that. And most small landlords aren't the one, most of the kind of small landlords is somebody, if you own a brownstone and you're renting out the other floor, or if you have extra space in your house and you're renting out, they're not the landlords that typically do that. It's typically if you own a lot of property and you want to force people out and you want to jack up the rents because you think you can get a lot more money, and kind of effectively trying to engineer a mass eviction is when that does happen. And so the important thing I think to realize is that if you're saying, if you agree, as most people do, even the people who are rent control, that's horrible, will be oh no, people shouldn't raise rent that much. Then it becomes the question of what's allowable, right? Because if you aren't allowed to double or triple in that single year, the question is, what is the percentage we should be talking about? And then what the regulatory structure is for that. And then kind of thing about is that and let's say if you had 10% growth allowable per year, that's saying that it has to take 8 years for it to double, rather than being able to double in a single year and force somebody out.
Jordan, you got any thoughts before we let our amazing guests give us their knowledge?
I think that there's a lot of, just to be clear, the government already puts regulations on price gouging. You can't go into a hurricane and quadruple prices for water or gasoline, right? We understand that crisis is time where you can't go into a war zone and start charging the government other things for things. We set prices. You can't raise utilities, right? Your gas prices can't quadruple overnight just because they feel like it. There are already those things. Charlie Baker oversees a healthcare monitoring price, like to try to lower the prices of healthcare, right? We already do this in other spaces. And a lot of the fear mongering goes right to like, oh, they want to freeze rents and control the amount of things. No, we want to have the same sort of controls on the marketplace that are already in place in lots of other places for those things. And a lot of the times, you know, the things that I get, and embarrassingly, I am a small landlord owner. I own a 3-decker in Worcester that I live in. You know, those we're not, you know, most of the people who come testify, some of those small landlords, they think it's actually the government telling them to set the price. They don't know what rent control is. They're not doing anything that would remotely touch any policies that are being floated around rent control. They're not doing any of those things. When things are broken, they're trying to fix them because I live here. I want to fix the thing, right? You know, and if they're, and prices, I don't think we've ever raised our rent in the years that we've owned this building. And most of my neighbors haven't either, right? Like they're just not, that's just not what's happening for those folks. So it's the folks who are trying to use the crisis of housing to try to enrich themselves at the expense of everyone else.
And no surprise, they're spreading disinformation. So let's have Mike Connolly, if you want to jump in and give us kind of a history of what has happened. Why can we not have rent control? Why is this a state thing? Why can't we just pass it in our cities? Like, tell us what's going on with rent control here in Massachusetts.
Sure, yeah, happy to do so. You know, the history you hear most about is 1970 or so until the year 1994. And throughout those years, primarily Cambridge, Boston, Brookline had rent control. I think for a while, Somerville had it and it went away as well, as I understand it. First and foremost, people should know the way it went away in 1994 was completely bogus. For years, the real estate industry and some of these landlord associations attempted to do away with it in Cambridge, Brookline, and Boston. As I know Beth will tell us later, this is the policy that people like, so they were not very successful in getting residents, particularly renters, to vote against their own interests. And so in 1994, they came up with an idea. Let's do a statewide ballot question, and then let's go to all those other communities where there's no political base to push back against this misinformation, and let's pour money into those communities and fight the battle among residents for whom there will be no interest, there'll be no base to defend it. And so in spite of that effort, being grossly outspent, and having to fight the battle on terrain where there was no natural base. Nevertheless, and this was 1994, so as you remember, the conservative strain in politics coming out of the Reagan era was still quite strong. This was back when welfare was being attacked, etc. Despite all of that, the ballot question barely scraped by. It got barely more than a fraction of a percent on the no side or the yes side, whatever it was, that did away with it, like 50 to 49 or 51 to 49. And so that implemented what is currently called Massachusetts Chapter 40P, which is the Rent Control Prohibition Act. That is what's on the books. My co-lead sponsor of the Tenant Protection Act, Rep. Nika Legardo, she has this really wonderful thing that she does when she testifies on this, where she actually goes into the language of that Rent Control Prohibition Act, which writes into law a faith in the free market. Essentially, this is on the books of the laws of Massachusetts. That act says that it's the free market that is the answer. Of course, as we see how this market is playing out and the incredible wealth disparities and the systemic racism that's built into it, the free market is unable to deliver housing for a large chunk of people. And, I'll get back to the history in a sec, but on that topic of the market, just want to also make the point, of the difference, even among Democrats, when it comes to major policy areas like education and healthcare. And this is something I've been saying on Beacon Hill, since I've arrived there. We all agree as Democrats, the government will play the central role in making sure people have education. We generally agree the government will play the central role in healthcare. There's obviously debate as to how serious we are about that, but generally we all sort of agree that. Then when it comes to housing, even Democrats are all over the map sometimes. We say the words housing is a human right. The work I'm trying to do, and I'm psyched to be here with you all today, is trying to make those words real. So anyways, let me step off that soapbox. You want me to get back to the history a little bit, or where?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay. So on the history, I said in the beginning, all you ever hear about, and I didn't even know much of this history until just very recently. I have a constituent, Bill Cunningham, who is a veteran of these rent control battles of the 1960s and 1970s. He has been a resident of Cambridge throughout that entire battle. I believe he was involved in the fight to bring it about, and then he witnessed and was a participant in the fights to defend it. And I was fascinated to learn that the history didn't start in 1970. The history actually started, around 1918 in New York City, and then in Massachusetts, really by the 1920s, we had rent control. And Bill Cunningham told us how Governor Calvin Coolidge, I think he was a Republican, he was on board with rent control. This was a bipartisan issue. This was an issue that conservatives embraced, as well as, your more liberal leaning folks. And think about that again, people always try to say like rent control is in conflict with production and economic growth. Well, not quite. We had rent control in the roaring 1920s. Then when the Great Depression hit, what happened was, because the economic system on the macro level collapsed, rents were naturally falling, and so there was no real political impetus to maintain rent control. So real estate industry landlords moved to get rid of it. There was no real political defense of it because rents were naturally falling. This brings us up to World War II, and then during World War II, rent control was once again implemented. And we had rent control provisions on the books in the later part of the 1940s into the 1950s. On the federal level, I believe a few years after the Second World War ended, it was done away with. However, at that point, states and some municipalities continued with it. My understanding is Massachusetts may have continued with it a bit longer. Certainly, we know in New York City, they continued with it. No problem with development in New York City, by the way. They've been doing just fine in terms of building stuff. And the final thing I'll say on this longer history, another thing I never appreciated was the connection between rent control, getting rid of rent control, and then doing urban renewal. And we understand the real racist legacy of urban renewal, where we looked to the inner city and we saw these rich, culturally diverse, often immigrant, working class people of color neighborhoods. And the best and the brightest said, we know what's good for these neighborhoods. We will force everybody out, smash their houses down, and put highways through the middle of their neighborhoods. And, we saw this happen in places like the West End in Boston, and we've seen this happen around the country. And what really fascinated me, I never knew this, obviously they had to attack rent control with its protections to stabilize tenancies in order to force those people of color, those working class folks, those immigrants out of their neighborhoods so that they could bring the massive highways into the inner city, which has now created decades of environmental justice outrage. And so to understand the connection, how this was a policy that was standing in the way of that kind of, environmental justice outrage, that kind of racial justice outrage, really was fascinating to me. And that sort of is the history. Urban renewal started And so there was this push to do away with it. And then with all of the revolution in the 1960s, sort of the movement, recapitulated, regained strength, and then that brought us up to 1970. And so to sum up the history, what I'll say is, if you look back on the past 100 years, what we're talking about today, rent control, rent stabilization, this is a normal policy. What is abnormal is the ongoing affordable housing emergency that we have endured over the past 25 years. What's abnormal is the wholesale displacement of working class, people of color, immigrant communities. What's abnormal is double-digit or triple-digit rent increases. Those are the abnormal policies. And the work we're doing, on Beacon Hill and here this afternoon is really, informing people about this perfectly reasonable policy that should be part of a comprehensive approach to addressing the housing emergency. So as you all know, if you started me now, I would talk about this for the next 72 hours. So I'll stop there.
Amazing. Well, it's so fascinating to understand sort of where we've been. And I love how you framed that for us, that rent control is the norm. And Beth, I would love to hear sort of what's happening right now with rent control. Where is that bill? I mean, it was a problem. It was a constitutional change. And so, what can we do and what is the strategy?
So right now, Mike and Nika Elugardo and also Adam Gomez in the Senate representing Springfield have filed the Tenant Protection Act, which is a comprehensive bill that includes lifting the ban on rent control. This is honestly, I think, other than the Votes Act, which includes same-day voter registration, the most important legislation for our democracy in Massachusetts. And the reason why I say that is because voter reg is tied to where you live. Every time you just think about the total displacement of people from the voter rolls every time people move. And so honestly, stabilizing people's housing is actually, I think, one of the most important ways to protect our democracy and how to go on offense in Massachusetts. And so right now, for this last Tuesday, on January 11th, we had an absolute blockbuster 7-hour housing committee hearing on a number of tenant protection bills, but I think the real blockbuster of the day was the Tenant Protection Act and also a rent control bill that Representative Rogers and Senator Jalen filed. I think the message was loud and clear that there is growing statewide momentum for lifting the ban on rent control. There's a longtime organizer named Lou Finfer who also has a history of rent control. And one of the notable things that stuck out to me is that 1970 was a key year for winning rent control 50 years ago, because there was a contested gubernatorial election when candidates were forced by a statewide tenants movement to commit to bringing forth rent control. Seems like another year to do that in 2022 when we have a likely contested gubernatorial campaign, and there's organizations across the state that are pushing for rent control. We saw that in the testimony on Tuesday when we had people from all over, from the Berkshires to Boston to Lawrence to New Bedford, all speaking in favor of rent control. From our count, we had 33 local elected officials from 13 municipalities who said if the statewide ban on rent control were lifted, we would try to pass rent control in our city. That is the most, I think that is one of the most compelling messages for why we need to lift the ban. Is local elected officials want to meet the local housing needs, the urgent housing needs in their communities. And right now the State House is the block on that being able to happen. And so that's a little bit of what's happening now. I think we can make this a core issue in the gubernatorial campaign. Of course, so much has happened in the housing market in the past 28 years since rent control was banned in 1994. If there ever was a time to get some concessions and commitments from from statewide elected officials or candidates for statewide office. I think 2022 is another banner year for making that happen. And so I hope that the whole progressive community is able to unite around this important issue that would allow local municipalities to address the really urgent problems that they're facing.
And I just want to tag in kind of to underscore a point that you just made about how activists have been very effective at elevating this in municipal elections, as well as that we've seen that in like the past few cycles, like it's especially in Boston, where it's become a much larger issue talked about in city elections. Whereas like in 2017, you wouldn't really have had much discussion about it at all. It might be like a throwaway point somewhere, or even prior to that. But in the ensuing cycles, since kind of a number of housing justice organizations decided that like we want to start working on this again and start elevating the discussion and helping that kind of those discussions on the municipal level can have that positive kind of that positive pressure upward as people start discussing both of like the need for it and the inability of the cities to do it without state action.
Right, and I think that's because there were some really successful kind of Bernie-inspired elected officials running in places like Somerville. You know, J.T. Scott and Ben Ewenkamp in Somerville really come to mind, who brought up rent control, and simultaneously a lot of who I would call normal people, not super political people, would just name that they wanted rent control when we talked to them on the doors. And, you know, I would facilitate trainings and, you know, we would talk about what are the problems, and people would literally just name, no, there needs to be rent control. And so, you know, I would do these trainings, particularly for many community development corporations, and their residents would just name rent control as the thing that they wanted. And, you know, anecdotally, like one time I was on the Red Line with Mike. We were coming back from a housing justice assembly with for I think Homes for All or Right to the City Boston in Dorchester. And, you know, I got off the train and, you know, Mike and I were talking about rent control on the train, and someone literally walked next to me after we both exited the train and said, were you talking about rent control? We really need that. I've literally, like, does anyone say that? Not to disparage any other policies, but like, does anyone say that about inclusionary zoning? No one ever says that about tenant option to purchase, right? It's only rent control that garners this type of popular support, popular demand. And I think if we want to organize people and meet people where they're at and also pass good policy, rent control actually accomplishes all of those things.
Yeah. So Mike, you've been in the state house for a few years now. What's been happening recently with policy related to housing and tenants? And how does it relate to the rent control discussion?
Sure, yeah, you know, it's a great question. And when I got to Beacon Hill, you know, there's a wide range of issues. I worked a lot on environmental policy in the city of Cambridge before getting elected. And when I got there, I sort of looked around and I'm like, where is there a need for more leadership and vision? Because we do have a number of state reps and state senators who are deeply focused on environmental policy, deeply focused on transportation policy. And the two areas, and I think Beth will appreciate this, housing for all and tax the rich. Those were the two areas where I was like, okay, there is a need for more leadership, for more effort. And so in my first term, I was able to get on the housing committee, and it's actually a funny story how I got on the housing committee. I'll share it with you. You get to ask for 3 committees. So I asked for the revenue committee because I said I want to fight to raise taxes. I asked for the transportation committee because I said I wanted to make public transit free. And then I said, I want to be on the housing committee because I just want to work with everyone. And I grew up in public housing and it would be good to do housing policy. So I sort of tried to slant it so my housing committee participation would seem
Didn't look too dangerous.
Perhaps a little less threatening. I guess I'm putting this in the podcast, but I just thought that was funny. Anyways, I got on the housing committee.
Nicely played.
And the focus was Governor Baker's housing choice bill, which personally, I see various sides of this. Exclusionary zoning is real. We have dozens of communities in Massachusetts that are located along transit lines, along the commuter rail, sometimes even, with a subway line coming nearby, that resist new multifamily housing. Personally, I feel like the district that I live in and Beth lives in, I feel like we are the housing production capital of the state. The Cambridge City Council considered a zoning change in Kendall Square to allow for a 500-foot residential tower over at the Volpe site. I think they voted on it 9-0, as I recall, or it was something like that. Clearly, Cambridge, Somerville, Boston have been doing extraordinary stuff to allow for new housing. In my first term, actually, I questioned Barry Bluestone when he came before the Housing Committee. And I asked him, how much of the new housing in all of Eastern Mass do you think Cambridge, Somerville, Boston is doing? Off the top of his head, he said, I would throw out a number around 75%. So anyways, that's just a way to set up, on the one hand, I do see the value in the housing choice bill. On the other hand, I scrutinized this bill extensively, perhaps, as much as anyone else. It did not mention the word affordable. It did not mention the word affordability. It did not mention the word tenant. It was a pure housing production bill that relied exclusively on the free market. And as we could talk about at great length, the free market is incapable of serving the needs of most residents, particularly when this is a market of investment on the global scale. And the person buying the property across the street from me in Cambridge, they're looking to get the best return on their investment anywhere in the world. And so those factors tend to, mean that we need more public involvement. Anyways,
I'm gonna jump in super quick, and just in case for people who aren't real into the housing debate here, in terms of the cost of housing, one theory is, well, it's going up because there's too much demand, and therefore we need to increase the supply, right? And that'll help reduce prices, right? If there's just more housing, so we just gotta build, and there'll be more housing. And so that is one of the solutions that is, especially if you fit it into the market, it's a market solution to housing prices, both purchase and rental being too high. And so it sounds like there was some movement last year in terms of some housing production bills. But tell us about the tenant protection. The other part is tenant protections, right? I mean, if you're forcing tenants out because you think you can raise the prices twice as much, and if those people can't afford it, then tough crap, they get to move 50 miles away. You just go ahead as a landlord and raise the prices twice as much, and then those people have to move. So that is the other question: is can you protect those tenants in a variety of ways so that they're not forced to move sheerly by the fact that we have zero rent control and any landlord can raise the rent as much as they want. They can quadruple the rent tomorrow if they feel like it.
Absolutely, yeah. And so that really brings me, when I talk about housing for all, I sort of break it down to three core components. Yes, we need smart housing production. Yes, we need strong tenant protections, and we need big public investment in housing. That's sort of the thing. When people say, we need to change zoning so we can have more housing, then the question is, well, who is going to fund that? Because if the public is going to play a key role, then yes, we know that new housing is apt to be affordable and accessible to a broad range of people. But if we don't do those second and third pieces of tenant protections and public investment, then we're not really clear if we're solving the problem. So where are we at?
Last session, you were saying last session there were two housing production bills that passed, as well as 2 tenant protection bills that went to the governor, and then what happened?
Yeah, and I will say briefly, I kind of got sidetracked myself. We were told at the end of the first session, we could only do the governor's bill and there could be no debate, no amendment, no add-ons to it. And I actually stood up and went to an informal session and made it known I wasn't going to allow this to happen, that we had to do this in a comprehensive way. So this brings us up to last session. We did do the governor's housing bill. We also did a requirement for multifamily housing near transit. So some 170 communities that have transit stations in their community will be required to at least zone for some multifamily housing near transit. Those 2 bills were put into the economic development bill, which, you know, in the middle of COVID was a very popular bill. Of course, we want to try to support small businesses, et cetera. And the success was, and I think this was a struggle, you know, it was a collective success of our movement for housing justice. We were able to get a tenant opportunity to purchase bill, as well as pieces of what's known as the Homes Act, and that's eviction ceiling, so that an eviction doesn't follow you around for the rest of your life, even if your name wasn't on the top of the lease. And those bills got sent to the governor right at the end of session, and that gave the governor the ability to sign the parts that he liked, and he vetoed out all of the tenant protections. There's a very sad Boston Globe headline that says Baker vetoes tenant protections. And of course, I've saved that headline because I want people to remember it. So that happened at the start of 2021. And so that sort of brings us up to where we are today. And so what I'm calling for and really working with colleagues to try to build support for is that we could now tackle the other pieces of this housing formula. We've done the production, 2 major bills, really the top 2 priorities for housing production advocates, but we've done nothing really permanent to protect tenants. And there's still more we need to do on that funding side. There are things like the transfer fee, the HERO bill, or I have a bill that would raise taxes on large corporations to truly fund a program of housing for all.
And if we, by the way, if we follow the money, let's not forget that housing production, there's a lot of developers who make a lot of money from housing production. So, you know, there is, housing production is not a neutral, it's not a money neutral piece of legislation. Whereas tenant protections, like the only people with money who are giving money in are the people who don't want tenant protections.
Just to that point, there's a group called the Massachusetts Housing Coalition. They're sort of a new group, and they appear to be associated with lobbyists who are associated with the real estate industry. They sent a letter to every homeowner, every business in Cambridge and Somerville, trashing the agenda that I just laid out and telling people that what I'm trying to do will make housing more affordable, more unaffordable, and that I was trying to raise taxes on everyone. When really I'm very clear what we're trying to do is raise taxes on the very wealthy and on big corporations. So I only mentioned that they were at the hearing, this Mass Housing Coalition. They had witnesses come and testify against rent control on Tuesday. So you're exactly right. There are these real forces out there who are lining up to fight us. The National Apartment Association put out a study this week that, you know, garnered probably half of the media coverage. And in the hearing, it was a 7-hour hearing. I actually questioned the person who produced the study and got them to recognize on the record that their study didn't actually correlate with the proposals we had on the table. But despite the incredible organizing by Homes for All and all of our, you know, coalition partners, the hearing was like 97% in support, 3% in opposition. Some of the media coverage sort of presented it as if it was this titanic debate, 50-50, and gave this little white paper that was not at all based on the proposals we have a huge amount of attention.
Well, that's what's funny. It's because you can totally see that all the people in this, it's very clear, all the people are on one side, pro rent control, and all the money is on the other side. Jordan, you want to jump in, and then Jonathan?
I just think it's important because this is one of the reasons that this podcast exists, is just the imbalance of reality. They we call it journalism, we call it reporting, but they stenographed a report. They didn't dive into it. They didn't read it. They didn't have somebody who understands it. I would bet that they at no point even read the quotes that they copied and pasted into the article, except maybe some copy editor along the way. Like, there's just this impulse to just like repeat, and then to both sidesism, to create this false dichotomy, right? Like, as if climate change is a debate among scientists, right? Or the idea that regular people are on one side or another, or the way in which they bury the fact that there are hundreds of local officials. They are testifying, and they are not testifying against rent control, right? Like, they're, Worcester, it's not just the Boston area. My city councilors in Worcester came and said, we're next, we're a problem. It's out of control. We need tools in our tool belt to control this thing that's happening, like we have tools in our tool belt for all other parts of our society, right? We need it here, and they're like, and the other side is trying to make that sound crazy, right? And the media just does this lazy thing of just being like, well, this seems like a good debate. Like, it's an uneven debate. It's like climate change. It's just they are allowing corporations to flood misinformation and things that they know are untrue without any critique or any sort of saying, this is not true and you can look it up.
Ooh, so we are going to wrap it up. Jonathan, you wanted to give a little bit of information?
Yes. So the quick thing I just wanted to intervene with is, since one of the values of the podcast is about explaining things that people listening might not be familiar with. So the things that I want to get people to explain that have been mentioned is what is an informal session? What is tenant opportunity to purchase? What is a transfer fee? And what is the hero bill? And quickly, before we wrap up.
Oh, is that me? Okay.
Yes, you have 5 minutes. You gotta do it in 5 minutes.
2 minutes.
Oh yeah.
2 minutes.
So informal session is just the regular session ends, and if there's unanimous consent and there's no opposition, then bills can pass outside of regular session.
And
there was an attempt.
That's supposed to be things like people need a liquor license, or somebody is sick, and weirdly our government needs to allow, like, they need to, for state government, they even a 1 hour of sick time needs to go be voted on by the state legislature. So it's supposed to be,
and so
not important things, not bills on actual housing in Massachusetts.
Yeah, and we were told we could do the governor's bill in an informal session, and I was sort of like, well, we have to do tenant protections as well, or I'm gonna have a problem with it. The Tenant Protection Act.
Tenants' opportunity to purchase.
Tenant purchase is simply legislation that if a property goes on the market and there are tenants living there, they will have a fair opportunity to meet the market price. And so if there's a bona fide offer on the table to buy the triple decker for 1.5 million, then the people living in the triple decker could have the opportunity. And what makes it powerful is they can partner with a nonprofit or a community development corporation to try to make that permanently affordable housing. What are the other ones?
Transfer fee.
Transfer fee, that's legislation I've filed as well, and that is simply a excise on the transfer of a deed. And you can be very creative about that. So one example, I mean, a building sells for $10 million. You could have a 1% fee on that transfer, and you can do some very creative things. The city of Somerville, I think, has been a leader on this. They've worked on this as a home rule petition. They've proposed a 1% fee for a buyer, a 1% fee for a seller. However, if that buyer is an owner occupant, they're exempt from the fee. And if the seller is an owner occupant, they're exempt from the fee. And the way they do that is they will look at the residential exemption status of either a would-be buyer or a seller. Beautiful idea, and also that can apply to commercial development. We have commercial buildings in my district where you can look at the history. 10 years ago, they sold for 60 million. 5 years ago, they sold for 100 million. More recently, they've sold for 200 million. So you look at that and you're like, okay, in 10 years, $140 million of profit has been extracted from our community. Could we not ask for 1% of that for affordable housing?
And we would love to talk
That's the
more about all
struggle.
these another time. And what was the fourth? It was just one more term.
The HERO bill.
So the HERO bill is legislation that Rep. Legardo and Senator Jamie Eldridge have done. It's similar to the transfer fee in a way. It would adjust the current deeds excise figure to raise additional revenue for both housing and the environment. HERO, the H and the E is housing and the environment. It's another wonderful idea. It would apply generally. So there would be sort of a more steady stream of income from across the Commonwealth. Our transfer fee bill would apply as a local option, and both of them would actually work well in tandem as a comprehensive way of raising revenue. And that's why I support both.
Fantastic. Wow, this has been amazing. We would love to talk to you more about more housing stuff, but in terms of rent control, we're all crossing our fingers, hoping that this is the year. Let's make it happen. Thanks so much, everyone. And we'll see you folks next week.